champions. We're so thrilled to have our lead champions on Capitol Hill join us today. Let's just move on to the next slide just for a moment to talk about who we have. As I already mentioned, Congressman Jeff Fortenberry of Nebraska and Congressman Mike Quigley of Illinois, our House of Representatives champions for the Act for ALS. I am Paul Melmeyer, MDA's Vice President of Public Policy and Advocacy. And a little bit later, we'll have Mark Fisher, MDA's Advocacy Engagement Manager, joining as well for a section on just exactly what the Act for ALS would do, not only for the ALS community, but for the entire neurodegenerative disease community. So our agenda for today, again, we're going to start with our champions on Capitol Hill, but from there we'll also move to a discussion on the legislation, what it would do, what it would accomplish if enacted, and how it would benefit those with ALS and with other neurodegenerative diseases. We'll also talk about how you all can get involved in actually making this bill become a reality for the community, and then we'll close with answering your questions. But really, without any further ado, we want to be able to bring in our champions, Congressman Quigley and Congressman Fortenberry. Again, thank you both for your time this afternoon. And we wanted to start with just a few questions for you both. And Congressman Fortenberry, I'm actually going to start with you. Now, both of you, of course, have taken leadership roles in the fight against ALS. What, or perhaps I should recharacterize who, has motivated you to lead this effort? Congressman Fortenberry.
Well, Paul, first of all, thank you so much, and to the entire community for joining us today. And let me say hi to my good friend, Mike Quigley. Your question is really a profound one, and I think I can point to two things, and both are interrelated, but could not have been predicted. Paul, when I was in third grade, you know, that's when you learned how to much more aggressively read, and you pick up entire books and you start reading entire books as a part of your classwork. And one of the earliest books I read, and maybe it was the first one, was on a baseball player named Lou Gehrig. And I remember that very vividly. And of course, one of his last words was, I consider myself to be the luckiest man alive, when he gave that famous speech at Yankee Stadium when he had to retire from baseball because of this unusual thing that was happening to his body that couldn't be identified at that time. Fast forward to last year, well, a couple years ago, my wife's younger brother, he was 34 years old at the time, he noticed a trembling in his hand, and by 38, he had died. He left behind 4 little children. He's my wife's godson. They had a particularly close relationship, and she still honestly suffers from that loss. And so we were cast into this community of persons who have ALS, who, again, it's not something that I went seeking, but it was cast upon us. And I feel so, in so many ways, in spite of the suffering, to be in solidarity with the ALS community and the entire community that suffers from neurodegenerative diseases, to see the courage, to see the longing, to see the commitment, to see the positivity, to see the tenacity to want to get something done, and frankly, has been very inspirational to me. So Mike and I have joined forces to try to commit to changing the way our government thinks about this. At least in Lou Gehrig's, I don't know when muscular dystrophy was first diagnosed as a separate disease category, but at least with Lou Gehrig's, you know, not finding any substantial movement toward treatments over 70 or so years, you got to change the research paradigm. And when you see things that are emerging that could show efficacy and promise, let's act fast. We don't have time to wait. So I want to commend Congressman Quigley for his partnership and his leadership in this regard. He's on point now with this bill. I think we're going to get this done, but the way to get it done is with you, Paul, leading your community as well and being solidarity with us. So thank you so much for inviting me to be on today.
Absolutely, Congressman Fortenberry, and thank you for those very profound words and for your leadership on this issue, of course. And Congressman Quigley, I'll pose the same question to you. Who has motivated you to be a leader for those in the ALS community?
Well, first, I want to give credit to my friend and partner on this, Jeff, who's just been tenacious. And, I think part of what we take from all this is when the stakes are high, there's no place for partisanship. There's only friendship and alliances toward the greater good. And I think as people who have served in Congress for a while, we've both witnessed the same thing. The courage and tenacity of the advocates, often those recently diagnosed with ALS, who have just made it their life's work with their families and friends to advocate for themselves, but for others as well. Work closely with the ALS Association as well, and our very dear friend Brian Wallach, founder of IMALS. You wake up sometimes with an ache or a pain and complain about it, and then someone makes this Herculean effort to reach out to you and carry something so important with such extraordinary aplomb. The absolute least we can do is move forward and get this done. As they say in that wonderful movie, hope is a good thing, maybe the best thing. In my mind, this bill goes beyond hope. It's achieving change.
Absolutely, Congressman Quigley. Well, let's talk a little bit about that change that this would achieve. For those on the webinar today who might not be familiar with the Act for ALS, tell us a little bit about what the bill would do.
Yeah, I'm going to give it 3 points, and I know your folks are going to elaborate. And if your questions stump the congressman, Allison Jarris, my freshly minted star chief of staff, and Jeff and his staff can also fill in. But look, there's 3 main pillars. It would expand access to phase 3 clinical trials for patients, enabling a greater number of individuals, including those ineligible to participate in studies, with potentially promising treatments. Second, it creates a partnership with the Department of Health and Human Services that will bring government agencies, researchers, and drug sponsors together to advance our understanding of neurodegenerative diseases. And lastly, Act for ALS establishes a new grant program to award funds for research on neurodegenerative diseases and potential interventions. So that's sort of the cut and dry versions of it. Later on, I know you have some experts to go into some more detail as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Congressman Quigley. I think you summarized the potential accomplishments of the legislation quite well. Congressman Fortenberry, I'd invite you to add anything from there. I'd also ask, this legislation is important for not only the ALS community, but really anyone with a neurodegenerative disease. Maybe talk a little bit about anything further with the legislation you'd like to mention and how it could really benefit a very, very large number of Americans.
Yeah, it's a great point, Paul. Obviously, the Act for ALS is appropriately named, and Mike and I have worked extensively and intimately with the community that's suffering from that disease category. But when we change the research paradigm to look into the deeper causes of neurodegeneration, it's got all types of applications across multiple disease categories. So that actually is what is also very powerful about this. And let me point out what Mike said is to me, who runs appropriations for me, and a long career in public health, who has just done tremendous work on navigating the multiple persons who preceded Mike and me, in terms of the scientific community, the research community, as well as the various associations. So I want to commend him for navigating, again, the subtleties and the nuances to try to get us to a place where there is much broader agreement of people who were invested way before us, but also to a system that needs to be challenged. And as Mike well said, we don't have the time to wait. So I think we've got good momentum. We've got, again, a solid piece of legislation, sound technical advice that has been given to it, strong bipartisanship, and we got to nearly 300 members of Congress that sponsored it last year. We need you guys in the community, the broader community, to keep pushing in that regard. It helps us by you create the preconditions in which people are receptive to the conversation that then we can have with them. So your advocacy, your passion really does make a big difference.
Yes, absolutely, Congressman. And we'll be talking a lot more on this webinar, precisely how the community can get involved to support the legislation. Congressman Quigley, I'd like to go back to you. Now, the legislation hasn't been introduced as of yet. As of today, it's not an introduced bill. Perhaps you're willing to break some news on introduction timeline, but tell us just a little bit how this bill can become law. Well, what's the process of getting this bill from where it is today actually passed by the House of Representatives, by the Senate, signed by President Biden? How do we get this bill across the finish line?
Sure. Let me just add how this crosses over matters to us all. I have witnessed the band of brothers and sisters in the neurodegenerative community. My father passed Parkinson's, so there's reasons we all work together on this. Look, Jeff said it best. Last term, we had 270 members of Congress sign on to this. And a lot of that was his extraordinary work with his staff and the momentum this thing has. This is like a few pieces of legislation I've seen have such organic strength. It really has been a grassroots effort of people pushing up because it matters so much to them. Here, I'm hoping that we cross all the lines of the communities that care about neurodegenerative diseases, and this is the time to show how America can work together. Reach out to your representative and your senator. Everyone should get on this bill. It is so critically important for the health and well-being of everyone afflicted with these diseases. But I also think now is the time for this country to show when it comes to accomplishing great goals, we can work together. So to answer your question, reach out to your member. If your member's on, find a friend or a relative in a district who's not on the bill, help them understand it, explain it to them, get your senators on it. If there's ever time to draw together, this is it, folks.
100%, Congressman Quigley, 100% on that. And Congressman Fortenberry, I'd ask you to add to that. Why is the voice of an individual with ALS or with a neurodegenerative disease or their loved one or a caregiver so impactful to you or so impactful to another representative who may be considering signing on to this? Why is that voice so powerful?
Because you're authentic. You're expressing a profound need for an important social good that we can deliver. It's not abstract. It's not about some remote policy. It's about life and death or advancements in health so that normal life can be led, or at least bad circumstances can be mitigated. When those stories are told, look, a lot of people see politicians as remote and aloof, and I understand that. We're human beings too, with families, and Mike and I have gone through particular suffering with this disease category, but everybody has some woundedness in their heart. And again, those of you who are suffering from these disease categories have a particularly poignant story to tell. And frankly, as I mentioned earlier, Paul, the way in which I've interacted with the community, the hopefulness, and sometimes even in the midst of suffering, the joy of embracing the suffering and trying to move it towards some productive end. There's nothing more powerful than that can break through the hardest heart. And sometimes hard, processes in government and even individuals in government, they can have hard hearts. So, I'll just tell you a story that has two components. I was sent a painting, a woman who is suffering with a particular form of ALS. She had a kind of a dream or a vision in which she was being nuzzled by an elephant trunk, the symbol of the Republican Party, and a donkey's face, symbol of the Democrat Party. And she was just being held up by both animals. And she actually commissioned this to be painting the idea, the vision, the dream that she saw. And she sent it to me. And I was so touched by this that I went down to the floor of the House of Representatives and just gave an off-the-cuff speech about the importance of this bill. And what we're trying to do, as Mike outlined, the three components of it, to make some changes in the way in which we approach research, to create the dynamics in which there is much more focused collaboration and attention on this disease, and better access to possibly effective treatments. I got back to my office and the phone was ringing, and somebody had forgotten, it was at night, and forgotten to turn on the answer machine. So I just answered it, and I'll do that every now and then. And a lady from Colorado had called, and I live in Nebraska, so it's Mike and I, our first obligation is obviously to the constituents that we represent. So it's harder to take a phone call from somebody farther away. And so she just said, I just want to leave a message for the congressman. I have ALS, and I saw his speech, and that was profoundly hopeful to me, what they're trying to do. Well, you can't imagine what that does to me, because frankly, this is a hard business. It's hard to get elected. It's hard to stay elected. And in the midst of a divided country in politics, it's hard to do legislation. But when you get encouragement from people like yourself in the community that you shepherd here, Paul, it reconnects you. It tethers to the original reason you went into public policy in the first place, to politics in the first place, to try to do some good. And this is the space that I do think demands a public response. And anyway, I'm sorry to get off on that, but I think it's a great question. And I think, again, your stories can mean so much when you tell them to the individual member. And we saw that last year when Mike and I worked to try to get co-sponsors. The communities had reached out to their members, and it laid the groundwork for us to be able to communicate what we're doing effectively, and for members to act.
Paul, I buried the lead here. We're introducing this bill this week, so get going, folks. We're ready to pitch it up again. Get her done.
Yes, Congressman Quigley, I didn't want to steal your thunder. That's your news to break, certainly, and thank you for breaking that. And you'll be hearing much more from not only MDA, but from our partners at IMALS, at ALS Association, of course, both the offices of Congressman Quigley and Fortenberry this week on that introduction. I'll just leave you both with one final question, because I know you're both very busy, and you're welcome to stay, of course, for the remainder of the webinar. But one final question for you both is just what parting words would you have for the community today? Or what would you like to leave the community with today before we move on with the content? Congressman Quigley, I'll start with you.
We may, people ask me if I watch House of Cards. Let me say, we may be living House of Cards, but we have to act and move forward like Frank Capra wrote the script for this. This has to be more like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. This has to be about West Wing. This has to be about all the corny reasons we thought about why we care about this country, because it gets down to taking care of each other, that we have more in common than we have apart. So let this be just a really good example of uniting to do something greater, and us moving forward. This country rarely does anything well that's not some big thing, right? You know, we think of the moonshot, the Manhattan Project, the New Deal. Those were all grandiose, big plans, and that's when this country really shined. So let's do the same on this.
Wonderful.
So Paul, I'll add, that was beautifully said by my friend Mike Quigley. You know, when you first get to Congress, I thought, wow, I gave a pretty good speech there. I did my job. Then you realize, you know, I better try to get that initiative through the entire committee. Then you realize, okay, let me try to find people who might not traditionally be a part of a political coalition and explain the idea to them. Let's try to get this passed in the House. oh yes, that was a great accomplishment, but let's get it done in the Senate. But they have to start in their committees too. And then when all that finally comes together, there's a president who has to sign it into law. It is a process. So we can't lose sight of that. Great job, Mike, on getting it introduced this week. We're going to rev the engine and we're going to peel out and get going. And if you guys can do that with us, that would be great. I would just say to your members, Paul, MDA the MDA can tell the story in the aggregate for you, but if you'll go the extra mile and be willing to be vulnerable to your member of Congress, it does mean things. If that's possible for you to do, to just be vulnerable and explain how important this is, it can affect the system.
Wonderfully said, Congressman Fortenberry. And I think we'll leave it at that. So Congressman Quigley, Congressman Fortenberry, we're both we're very grateful for both of your time today. We're really excited for our potential introduction here later this week. Expect a lot more from both offices as well as your advocacy organizations here. And again, I'll just close by saying thank you both for your leadership. We couldn't do this without you.
Thank you. God bless.
Thank you, Paul.
Okay.
Take care. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we are ready to move along with our topic today, which is a deeper dive into the Act for ALS. You know what? Before I get there, I have been want to mention another superstar in this field, which is Allison Jarris, who is Congressman Quigley's right-hand woman on all of this, and she is really the staff lead on all things Act for ALS. This Congress. Allison, would you like to add anything from what Congressman Quigley and Congressman Fortenberry already said?
Thanks, Paul. I certainly don't want to cut you off in terms of moving forward in the program, so I'll echo both my boss and Congressman Fortenberry's comments and associate myself with them, and really appreciate you hosting us and all of your amazing work on this bill, especially from the perspective of coalition building and cross-disease communities. What I was going to offer to do just to help you was I'm watching some of these questions come in on the chat, and I was just going to answer them really fast for you.
By all means.
And then I'm happy to stay on for the duration. So if there's questions that come in throughout, I'm happy to be here to potentially go into a deeper dive once you go through the more legislative oriented stuff beyond the top lines. I have been eating, breathing, sleeping this bill for the past 2 years, but particularly the past 2 months. So I could probably recite it to you verbatim at this point. And if I don't, I have it pulled up on 3 computers in front of me with lists and everything else. So just to right off the top, to be more clear, the bill is being introduced on the House side tomorrow afternoon at noon. We have a pro forma session. We are already at, this is newsy as well, 67 original co-sponsors. So we are picking off those members that had sponsored in the past. So we're very excited because we think that the momentum that we built in the previous Congress is absolutely at our back. We believe that the goal of getting 300 co-sponsors is not ambitious in any way, given where we landed last session. So we hope to be there quickly, and that will happen, of course, with MDA and all of your partner organizations' support. I understand that in terms of the coalition building, it's true that this bill that we are introducing is ALS focused. So I don't want to misspeak to somehow represent that it's not, especially in the context of this conversation with MDA. However, I just wanted to sort of tease out why that's important. First of all, Paul, you've done an amazing job of already aligning yourself as a community with the, particularly in the rare space, right? Like, we are stronger together. And that sounds like a cliche thing sometimes when you're in politics, but there is absolute truth to that. That cross-community collaboration helps really, all boats rise type of mentality. So to Jeff Fortenberry's point on changing the paradigm, this is the first of what we hope to be many steps. We know that there was a specific need as it relates to ALS, given its 100% fatality and the extremely short timeline that people go from diagnosis to death. However, we also know that the research, particularly the basic research that we are pushing for at NIH, is imperative to the entire neurodegenerative community. And that also builds upon using this bill as a first step to go to a potential ARPA-H, which, as we know, President Biden has endorsed. We're working very hard to ensure that not just ALS, but other neurodegenerative diseases are listed explicitly far beyond Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Again, to my boss's point, Parkinson's was an entry point for us into this space. And so we know that the basic science research can lead to discoveries across the board, especially when you're talking about rare neurodegenerative, just given these synergies that exist both in the science, the brain, et cetera, and again on the treatment side. So that's why we've explored things like orphan drug programs, and that's why we've explored sort of using that science to push us further along across disease communities. So I don't want to misspeak, and this bill is not really open for edits at this point. It's been a humongously long slog, but this is not to say that our bosses only care about ALS because it's ALS. This is to say that ALS had an urgent need given its fatality, and that we want to use this as an opportunity, particularly in the context of an ARPA-H for neurodegenerative, to really change the way that NIH and FDA do their work, both on the research side and even more importantly on the access to treatment side, so that we can more quickly get people access to new drugs. And again, we think that there is going to be a cross-disease synergy that exists if we're able to move this forward. It's amazing how stuck people get and in the way that things are done. And so it's been an experience for me. I've been on Capitol Hill for 10 years. This bill will probably end up being like my life's work in some way, because I never could have. It's amazing to see both the balance of intense bipartisan, nonpartisan support that we've been able to build, while also still trying to educate people who are really in positions of extreme power at the agencies. And to rewind, we've done immense work between this introduction and last introduction to engage FDA and NIH. My boss has had, and also Congressman Fortenberry, I don't want to speak for his staff, but I'll speak for Quigley. We've had multiple conversations with Acting Administrator Woodcock at FDA. She has been, frankly, really responsive to us. She has provided us access that we did not have the ability to do in the previous administration. So we have really come a very far way in actually identifying our partners that sort of might feel like they're in the black box of the bureaucracy over there. People want to do the right thing. We just need to continue to get patients in front of them so that they really can understand that these decisions are not being made in a vacuum, that they're affecting real people's lives, that we need to get them access to treatment, not because we're trying to somehow cut the line or make our drug pipeline the Wild West. In fact, it's the exact opposite, which is to give people a fighting chance to save their lives. And that goes far beyond the right to try conversation, which of course has colored this bill as well. So I digress, but I think all that context is important. This bill is in stronger shape than it ever has been. And I think for those reasons and that serious level of collaboration that we've done with the agencies, the technical assistants, our bipartisan partners across Congress, the Energy and Commerce Committee on the House side, the Senate Health Committee on the Senate side, our bicameral partners and Senators Coons and Murkowski, who will also be dropping this bill this week. We will be putting out our release tomorrow with and MBA. I don't think I'm breaking any news. You'll be included in that press release as an endorsing organization. So it's going to be a big release. It's really celebratory. And it honestly comes on the piggyback of, additional ALS and also, again, neurodegenerative focus that's happening at NIH and across government. So that kind of speaks to the holistic overview, why the bill is not currently open, what we can do in the future. I want to stay, of course, as connected to MDA as possible so that we can continue moving this ball forward beyond just the Act for ALS. And again, both of our bosses are appropriators. We've done incredible work so far on the Appropriations Committee to actually fund some of this research through the Defense Department. It's a really clean, easy place to get some of this research done. I think there's a model there for expanding. And again, I just keep going back to ARPA-H. I mean, that will trump anything that we could possibly do in these sort of standalone bills. Once the bill is, we will put out who the reps that are in support of the bill. It'll be part of our press release. You can see that on our social media, our website, quigley.house.gov, fortenberry.house.gov. All the groups that have endorsed, including MDA, will have a joint statement and will have follow-up communication. So I hope that there will be quite a rollout that's both through our traditional press channels and our social media channels. And it is not too late to contact your House member or senator. Like I said, we're dropping this bill tomorrow at noon. That's during our pro forma. We're doing that in honor of ALS Awareness Month. So this is kind of like the last possible moment. We're trying to get as many people on. My goal is to introduce this bill with over 100 original co-sponsors, which is really going to send an incredibly important signal to the powers that be that this bill really means business and that we have an extremely strong and building bipartisan coalition who can see far beyond sort of the bureaucratic red tape that has existed for too long in this space, and that we have to change the paradigm, shake up the status quo, do things differently to move the ball forward. I think that there's a couple other questions here. Is this okay, Paul? I don't want to.
Yeah, by all means. Please go ahead.
Okay. I know you have a program, and I'm a scheduled person myself. I don't want to be disrupting anybody's itinerary. That's, yeah.
Not at all.
So, so there's a couple just more questions on logistics. You know, we really want to get this bill done this year. Again, I've already talked about the reasons why with the new administration about, you know, you can't just let things like stagnate, right? We did incredible work to get to this place last Congress, and now this is the moment to use that wind at our back. We were extremely thoughtful in engaging these partners who, you know, were not necessarily supportive of the first iteration, and then we had a second iteration. You know, this is really Act for ALS 3.0 at this point, maybe even 4.0 if we're talking about how many edits we've gone through. But the point being, we undertook a serious effort to bring many, many diverse partners who have the same philosophical goal of treating and curing these diseases, but don't have the same idea about how to do it. And I think that that's an extremely fine needle to thread. So I always want to communicate that too, just from a pragmatic point of view, because it's extremely easy to say, well, this bill doesn't include this, or you cut this. There is horse trading. I mean, we're talking about an incredibly diverse group of not just advocates and disease communities, but so many equities that we're serving with different perspectives. And so we are trying to find a silver bullet that can appeal to a lot of groups. So I think that with that momentum, that also points to why we need to get it done this year. The new administration is positioned, especially at the White House specifically, beyond the agencies, to help us do this. I think that we have a president who understands not just healthcare, but actually really understands the value, not just of an ARPA-H, but of the new way of thinking. I think that there are people in and around the actual executive building that we have access to that we just did not have access to in previous years. So the pieces are falling into place, and that really, I think, increases our urgency. And you don't want these bills to just sort of sit around for multiple years and multiple years. It's like, we can do this. We can do this now. It's going to take hard work. It's going to take some concessions. It's going to take compromise, but we absolutely can do this. And I guess the final question here is just to go on to the changes. The substance of the bill is really unchanged. The majority of the changes were technical in nature, which is not to discount them because they were extremely important in hopefully moving NIH and FDA forward in terms of how they would actually implement this, despite them still having some questions that we will continue to work through on our committee process. But we are in a stronger position now and much less adversarial with them and working with them as partners, which I think is hugely important. And so the technical changes are sort of the first bucket. We had a collaborative, we've renamed that, we've turned that into a public-private partnership. We've addressed, based on the technical assistance, some of NIH and FDA's jurisdictional issues about who actually would implement parts of expanded access. We've deconflated some of the research questions. That's sort of the big philosophical hurdle if we're talking about what's the big thing that people can't fully get their heads behind on this bill, what changes that status quo? Well, we argue that an expanded access program actually could provide us with important research data, and that we should not just let the data fall to the wayside. I'm happy to share either through this chat or at a later point, Paul, a list of the co-sponsors. We have our public dear colleague. If you want to circulate that to your list, I'm happy at the end of the day to kind of see where things land so that you can share that with people. I don't believe that, to answer this very specific question, Brian Mass is not signed on yet. The bill number does not exist yet because the bill hasn't been introduced. We'll have a bill number as of tomorrow, but you can keep, like I said, pinging in on all of our social media channels, traditional channels, press releases. We will do some creative stuff to make sure we get the word out as of tomorrow at noon. So tune in around 12:30 p.m. and we will get everything out to you. And again, I just want to echo, thank you for inviting us and including us in this. You've been such amazing partners and respectful and deferential to the congressmen both, who have just really poured an immense amount of effort into this. Myself and Ren, who on the staff side have done the same. Like I said at the top of my little presentation here, this really has become an incredible passion project for me, and I am deeply committed. Even as I'm now the congressman's chief of staff, I'm actually transitioning out of my legislative roles, so I will not really be the healthcare policy person, but there's no way that I'm giving this bill up. I will see it through to its absolute end. We still have a lot of hurdles to go, but I'm very, very hopeful that if we hit that 300 number, that we will just be too big to ignore. It's an artificial goal. I don't want to set that out there to say like, it has to be this. It's just as much capacity as we possibly could build, we'll get it across the finish line in the House. And we have great Senate partners as well who will also, and I think this Congress, even more so than last, are much more deeply engaged. And I think that we've just been coordinated in a whole new way. So I'm excited. I'm excited to end the ALS Awareness Month. I'm excited for partner organizations like MDA to be involved in this fight, to keep moving the ball forward, to keep growing, to expanding access, to expanding treatment, to building on this research, and to getting this bill passed and signed this year, very hopefully. So thanks again, Paul. Thanks to everybody at MDA. I really appreciate it.
Well, absolutely, Allison, and thank you for joining us today. And again, thank you for also having your boss join us as well, as he's really been such a leader in this space. That was Allison Jarrus. She's the Chief of Staff for Congressman Mike Quigley, and really the leading staff member on the entirety of Capitol Hill on the Act for ALS. So, Allison, I'm going to let you take a breath, take a sip of water here, and we're going to talk a little bit about what's actually in the bill, and if there are further questions that the community has, maybe we can bring you back on a little bit later. And I know many of you have already found the Q&A box at the bottom of your webinar page, but if you have additional questions that arise as we talk a little bit about the content of the bill, or if you're just discovering it now, please do ask us questions. We will have a short period for questions at the end of the webinar. We'll try to get to as many as we can on the Act for ALS before the hour ends. So let's just talk a little bit again about what the legislation does for those who are unfamiliar with the Act for ALS. There are three main things that the bill does. For one, it would foster greater access to promising experimental therapies for those in the ALS community. It would actually accelerate therapeutic development, not just for those with ALS, but for really the entire neurodegenerative disease community. And that does include the neuromuscular disease community. So as we're talking about muscular dystrophies, as we're talking about other motor neuron diseases or myositis, mitochondrial diseases, the list goes on of neuromuscular diseases for which MDA serves the community. Those diseases would indeed actually, those populations would indeed be benefited by this legislation, not only to accelerate therapeutic development in those areas, but also foster greater coordination, not only within government agencies, but also within the entire stakeholder community on the fight against all neurodegenerative diseases. So at this point, I want to bring in Mark Fisher. He's our Advocacy Engagement Manager. We have collected some of the most common questions that we receive on the Act for ALS. And he's going to pose some of those questions. We're going to answer some of those questions. And then again, if there's anything we don't cover, we're here to answer them at the end of the program. So Mark, I turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Everyone, my name is Mark Fisher, Advocacy Engagement Manager here at MDA. Thrilled to be here. I think we have a lot of questions that we received. I think good news is some of them are mirroring what we see in the chat. So that's really exciting that we can answer those for you. So it's my job to try to stump Paul, but I don't think that will be possible. So let's just get to some of them. First, broadly, how would this legislation actually accelerate access to experimental therapies? How would that actually happen, Paul?
Yeah, so really, as I said earlier, the very first pillar of this legislation is trying to foster greater access to experimental therapies. And what we mean by experimental therapies is any therapy that has not yet been approved by the Food and Drug Administration. So it's still in clinical trials, it's still being tested. So what the legislation would do is it would create a grants program that's administered by the NIH that covers, that offers grants to cover the direct costs of actually administering such an expanded access program. And this actually addresses one of the most substantial barriers that especially small biotechnology companies that are developing therapies for ALS face. And that's that they just can't afford it. Because there are rules in place that would disallow that company from, for one, actually obtaining a profit from a therapy that has not yet been approved by the Food and Drug Administration. And of course, it costs money to actually develop additional doses of the therapy, actually then administer it, whether in a hospital or another location. That's pricey. And for a very small company, that just might not be doable. So what this legislation would do, it would address that very financial hurdle that these small biotechs could face if they want to give access to an experimental treatment outside of their clinical trial through an expanded access program. This grants program would help fund that access. And that's not something that exists right now, does not exist today. This would be a new program that really could change the paradigm of access to experimental treatments outside of clinical trials for those in the ALS community.
Great. So obviously, how would this actually then change the current process of accessing experimental therapy, and how would that change under this bill? Obviously, it wants to change something. So what would the changes we would see?
So the actual process of obtaining an experimental therapy through expanded access wouldn't actually change particularly dramatically. The process would still involve an individual with ALS and their caregiver actually working with their physician to determine that an experimental medicine may be right for them. They then would contact the biopharmaceutical company to see if the biopharmaceutical company is actually willing to offer the therapy. And that's, again, the hurdle that oftentimes individuals can't get past for a number of reasons, which I'll mention in a moment. But if the biopharmaceutical company is on board, the FDA then needs to sign off. FDA signs off in the vast majority of these situations, and IRB approves, and then access can be granted through an expanded access program. Now, one thing that is potentially different that this bill would facilitate is actual data collection through expanded access. And this is actually very important because we can learn a lot through expanded access programs, not nearly as much as one can learn from a clinical trial. And that's important to mention. The clinical trials are still what actually determine if a therapy is safe and effective. But expanded access can add some context. It can add some anecdotal information through the data collected there. And that's the data that would want to see collected through these expanded access programs. And that's what this bill would also facilitate.
Excellent. So who exactly would benefit from this particular part of the bill?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark. And, it is somewhat limited in that, again, this is only for individuals with ALS. So this part of the bill does not apply to everybody else with a neuromuscular condition or a neurodegenerative condition. In addition, the therapy and under potential access, under expanded access, would need to be in a phase 3 clinical trial. So treatments that are still in phase 1 or phase 2 would not qualify under the legislation. Additionally, in order to receive funding through the grants program, the company that's developing the therapy would need to be a small, qualify as a small business, a small biotech. So if we're talking, if Pfizer all of a sudden, let's say, has an ALS therapy, I don't think anyone's necessarily going to consider them a small business. So it's unlikely that they would actually qualify under this program. But at the same time, the Pfizers of the world might not be facing those same financial hurdles that the small biotechs of the world would be in actually offering a therapy through expanded access. So the eligibility is still somewhat limited within the legislation, but we all know there are many, many, many individuals in the ALS community who cannot access a clinical trial today. I don't want to paint a picture in which there's only a handful of individuals that would be benefited by this or could potentially be benefited by this, because there are many in the ALS community who don't otherwise qualify for a clinical trial, and their only option other than the already approved therapies are expanded access. And it is they who could very well be benefited by this legislation.
Great. Another part of the bill is accelerating development of therapies. So how would this bill actually speed up that development, including those who are living with ALS?
Yeah, so this is really the second pillar of the legislation that Congressman Quigley mentioned at the outset. And this is trying to get therapies to the market that much quicker. And there are really 3 initiatives within the legislation that would all work towards this goal. The first would be a public-private partnership that Allison's already mentioned, and this is not ALS specific. This is for all rare neurodegenerative diseases. And under this partnership, not only the FDA and the NIH and other federal governmental entities could be working together to try to collaborate on getting rare neurodegenerative disease therapies to market that much quicker, but also organizations such as MDA or organizations such as ALS Association or IMALS, or some of the organizations that we know are on the call today, perhaps the Myositis Association or other organizations for other rare neurodegenerative diseases that could be part of this partnership, that could then all work again towards collaborating to get therapies to market that much quicker than what we have today. In addition, FDA would be creating an action plan on, again, not just ALS, but all rare neurodegenerative diseases. It's ALS putting forward an action plan of this is what it's FDA putting forward an action plan on this is what FDA will be doing to try to accelerate therapeutic development within rare neurodegenerative diseases. And then if those two efforts aren't enough, there's also a good amount of funding in this legislation that would actually go towards funding those projects in rare neurodegenerative diseases that may otherwise be struggling for funding. Perhaps they just haven't attracted enough biopharmaceutical interest. Perhaps for one reason or another, finances again are a challenge in actually developing this new therapy and then bringing it to market. This new grants program that's housed at FDA would actually look for those kinds of efforts to fund to actually then try to bring those therapies to market that much quicker. So it's really filling the gaps of our current therapeutic development system in rare neurodegenerative diseases, not only with these collaborations and with the FDA action plan, but actual funding that would go along with it. And in addition, it would also work to facilitate that collaboration that may not be happening today, which I think if we move on to the next slide, would address the barriers of potentially developing new therapies within ALS and neurodegenerative diseases today. And let me first tell you what those barriers are to move on to the next slide. And then I'll tell you how this collaboration could potentially address those barriers. So, I think many on the call today are familiar with the barriers to therapeutic development in ALS. For one, we're much further behind in actually developing patient-focused endpoints and clinical outcome assessments. And what clinical outcome assessments are, they're ways to measure not only the progression of disease, but also potential slowed progression of disease, or they're ways to measure whether a new therapy is working. And there are really, really, really innovative ways that have been developed in other disease areas. Cancer is a perfect example of this, that really tie so well to the experience of an individual with cancer. But for some reason, we're pretty far behind, not only in ALS, but actually across neuromuscular diseases more broadly, and actually developing these new patient-focused endpoints and clinical outcome assessments. For those of you who perhaps have participated in a clinical trial or loved ones participated in a clinical trial, you may have thought about how their experience was being measured, and does that really actually capture what's most important to your loved one or most important to you? And so this is one area in which therapeutic development in neurodegenerative diseases is unfortunately pretty far behind. Same goes for developing biomarkers and surrogate endpoints, which again can facilitate therapeutic development, because if you have a biomarker or surrogate endpoint in hand, you kind of unlock a new way in which you can test the safety and effectiveness, in particular effectiveness, of a new treatment, which can actually get it through clinical trials that much quicker and get it to patient populations that much quicker. We all know there's a great amount of heterogeneity in ALS and other rare neurodegenerative diseases. And clinical trials aren't exactly progressive in their design. Again, we can look to other disease areas such as cancer, other areas in which you see some really, really innovative ways of running a clinical trial and testing whether that therapy is safe and effective. We just don't have that innovation necessarily within ALS or other neurodegenerative diseases, with some notable exceptions. I should give a nice shout out to the Healy platform trial. There's other platform trials under development. Those are the kinds of innovation that we need to see, but we need to see it much more widespread than we're seeing right now. The kind of evidence that is submitted to FDA, again, it's rather behind the times in neurodegenerative diseases compared to other disease areas. And then also the development of patient experience data that can add really important context to the actual experience of an individual with the disease, either in a clinical trial or even outside a clinical trial for that matter, which can inform not only those in the biopharmaceutical industry on how to develop a new therapy, but also the FDA on how they should be evaluating a patient's experience with a new therapy, without a new therapy, in a clinical trial, outside a clinical trial. So these are all ways in which, these are all barriers right now that we're facing, because we're not far enough along in these areas compared to other disease areas, and it shows. Now, these are all areas that would be covered by the public-private partnership, and many of these areas would be covered also by the FDA action plan, because FDA would be writing about how FDA is going to choose to try to tackle these barriers, but also how all of us can work together to tackle these barriers in partnership with the FDA, in partnership with the NIH, in partners with academic institutions, with other nonprofit organizations, with the community at large. All can be working together under the public-private partnership to tackle these areas. So Mark, I know I've skipped ahead a little bit here, but these collaborative areas would help really address some of the barriers that we unfortunately still face, not only in ALS, but other rare neurodegenerative diseases as well.
I think that's important, definitely. And another question I kind of wanted to ask is, you know, if someone's on the call who's living with ALS or neurodegenerative disease or have a family member, what are the immediate effects that they can expect if this bill passes? You know, what could they see quickly if this gets passed?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark. So it's very important that any legislation that is considered not only is beneficial towards individuals with ALS who may still yet to be diagnosed, but really today's ALS community. And this bill really would benefit not only today's ALS community, but all individuals today who are living with the rare neurodegenerative diseases. For one, if the legislation is enacted, we would be breaking down those financial disincentives to accessing experimental medicines for the ALS community. And so therapies that may be either in phase 3 right now, or let's say they're still in phase 2, but may soon be in phase 3, if this bill was to be enacted, expanded access programs for these experimental treatments would be that much more likely to be set up and available to, again, today's ALS community. In addition, the infusion of funds into the treatment-focused grants program at the FDA, in which, again, as I mentioned earlier, there might be areas in which funding may be lacking for potential experimental treatments that could hold a lot of promise. Those clinical trials could potentially be launched because of this treatments-focused grants program that the FDA would administer under this legislation. And as we know, the more clinical trials available to the entire rare neurodegenerative disease community, but also the ALS community, of course, the better. That many more opportunities to participate in research and to actually accelerate development of new ALS and neurodegenerative disease therapies. And finally, that FDA action plan, if this bill was to be enacted tomorrow, it's introduced tomorrow, but let's say it's enacted the day after, it won't be, but yeah, a man can wish. Then 6 months after enactment, FDA will be publishing their action plan. And that's pretty quick. And there's going to be a lot of stuff in there that we can then start working on, FDA can start working on from there. So those are all ways in which this bill would benefit not just today's ALS community, but today's rare neurodegenerative community more broadly.
Great. I will say we're coming up to the top of the hour, but Paul and I are willing to stay for a bit. So, you know, we have some more things to get through. We recognize we're coming at the top of the hour, but we're not going to cut it off right at the top of the hour because we have some more important things to talk about. So we'll be here. So if you can stay on, that'd be great. We have a few more things we'd like to chat about. But obviously, none of this will happen if it won't get passed. So how do we actually get this enacted into law, Paul?
Yeah, and this really goes to not only what Congressman Fortenberry and Congressman Quigley were saying, but also Allison was saying. First of all, let's get those co-sponsors. It was really great that we already have at least 67 original co-sponsors for the House legislation, as Allison's already said. Who knows, in the time that I've been droning on for the last 20 minutes, maybe we're already up to 70, you never know. But get those co-sponsors, get your representative on the legislation. That is first and foremost what is most important to really, again, show just how important this legislation is. We need to get right up to that 300 representative and senator support number that we had last Congress, and let's go even further than that. But from there, I wanted to mention, you know, some of the most important decision makers on Capitol Hill. And those are the committees of jurisdiction, that being the House Energy and Commerce Committee on the House side, and then the Senate Health Committee on the Senate side. And these are the committees that are actually going to evaluate legislation in the whole healthcare area for that matter, but specifically for today, the Act for ALS. So what really gets these members' attention that you see in front of you, not only is the support that of their colleagues that aren't on committee, and that's, again, let's get up to that 300 number at the very least, but also if you happen to be represented by any of these individuals, they are tasked with the policy area that Act for ALS falls under. And so what we need to do beyond just gaining co-sponsors more generally is try to get the attention of these individuals, including the individuals who lead these committees, to try to place this higher on their priority list. Because that way, if it's high on their priority list, they're more likely to hold hearings. And we're calling for eventually a legislative hearing on Act for ALS. And then from there, if we're able to have a legislative hearing, let's actually pass it out of committee. And once it's actually passed out of committee, that shows the broader House of Representatives or the broader Senate that this is a priority of those who are most experts on healthcare legislation. And that way, it's that much easier to actually bring it to the floor of either house, to get it passed on the floor of either house, and then to get to President Biden for his signature. So again, just to reiterate, let's get those co-sponsors, but then from there, let's also ensure that the House Energy and Commerce Committee and the Senate Health Committee are committed to also getting this bill passed as quickly as possible.
Excellent. Now, obviously, we all know that it's getting things passed in Congress isn't easy. It's probably not as easy as we were taught in high school civics. So there's definitely some challenges probably that we will face and hurdles we'll face. Can you talk a little bit about what those challenges might be?
Yeah, there are still a handful of challenges that have already been mentioned by Allison or by the congresspersons. So as I already mentioned, it's important for us to get this bill to the top of the priority list because congresspersons, and Allison can attest to this certainly, they are bombarded with requests every single day for support for any number of items of legislation. And same goes for the committees of jurisdiction for that matter. They have hundreds of bills that fall under their jurisdiction that they need to decide what are we going to spend our valuable time on and actually moving through committee, or actually if it's actually passed by committee, moving it through the entire House of Representatives or the entire Senate. So the first challenge that we face is just all of the competing legislative priorities that those on Capitol Hill have to consider. And that's why it's up to us, not only the advocacy organizations, but all of you, on making sure that this legislation is the priority of your representative, your senator, and those who are actually the decision makers on Capitol Hill. This is still a fairly new piece of legislation. As Allison already said, this has been around in one way, shape, or form for about a year now. This is in its third or fourth form or so at this point. There's a lot of new ideas in this bill, and that can really stretch certain that can kind of stretch the bounds of what some members may be comfortable with in the first place. And it's up to us to convince them, this is, even though you've only known about this bill or known about these potential legislative solutions for a little while now, we still need to pass this as soon as possible. This can't be one of those bills that sits around for a very long time without getting the attention it deserves. And then finally, there are still some concerns in pockets or in corners of Capitol Hill that we're all going to be working to address regarding this legislation. Some that Allison already mentioned pertaining to research and to if this is the very best bill to pass for the ALS community and for the neurodegenerative disease community. Again, it's up to us to ensure that we assuage those concerns that they may have, and we convince them to the viewpoint that this is the bill that needs to be enacted.
Excellent. So I'm going to group these last three together. We will ask for folks' help on the call, and we'll talk about that at the end. But what are we going to be doing, Paul, as MDA to get this passed as an organization? And how are we working with other groups to get it passed as well? And then what can people on this call do?
Yeah, very good questions, Mark. So what we're going to be doing, it's all hands on deck for MDA to try to get this enacted, starting with tomorrow's introduction. So you'll be hearing from us tomorrow. We're going to be working very, very closely with our partners at IMALS and our partners at the ALS Association, both of whom have been champions for this legislation, and both of whom we understand are again fully supporting the legislation this Congress, and will be encouraging the ALS community to support this Congress as well. But something we're also going to be doing is we're going to be collecting the support of all of the other patient advocacy organizations and other representatives for the rare neurodegenerative disease patient population in support of this legislation as well. So in the not so distant future, many of you may be hearing from us asking for those in the muscular dystrophy community, or those in the SMA community, those in the myositis community, in the mitochondrial community, the ataxia community, the list goes on, in supporting this legislation. Because again, while it is titled the Act for ALS, it is of course very beneficial for those with ALS. There are benefits this legislation would have for the broader rare neurodegenerative disease community. And so we're going to try to be bringing in everybody under the tent of this legislation to have it passed really as soon as we can have it passed. and what you can do to help. Mark, I would ask you that question for our final slide.
Absolutely. So first of all, so many great questions coming in on the right side. I don't know if we'll get to them, but I just really appreciate everyone's excitement about this, and we'll try to answer. Hopefully, we've answered some along the way. But first of all, how you can help for yourself. If you're not a member of MDA's Grassroots Network, that's your first step. It's the first and easiest step, and you can do that two ways. You can go to mda.org/advocacy and sign up right there, or you can actually text MDA USA to 50457. It'll walk you through how to do it that way. You know, looking at looking at who is attending the webinar today, I think we have lots of new people, which is super exciting for us. So if you're not a member of our grassroots networks, please join us. You will hear a lot from us when this gets introduced. Obviously, watch your email. I think we broke a lot of news today, which was very exciting. So definitely keep an eye on the next week of things that you can help. Watch our Twitter feed as well. That's probably where you get the most up-to-date news about what's going on with Act for ALS. I think we have a lot. I think our Twitter schedule was pretty busy this week with all the stuff we're going to be seeing, which is wonderful. When you sign up, you'll see our advocacy website. We'll definitely have an action alert and up there that you can take action on. We'll tweet it out so you can take action on. There's a lot of questions about, is my person co-sponsoring not? Are they not a co-sponsor? The good thing is with our system, if your member is not a co-sponsor, you'll know that. It'll immediately make sure that you send them a message to ask them to co-sponsor if they're not one. If your member is a co-sponsor, ask you to thank them for their support. So our system kind of takes that guesswork away from you, which is really nice. And then if you have any questions, we have lots of great questions here on the right. You can always contact us at advocacy@mdausa.org. Paul and I see those. You're emailing us, so we will see those as well. But the first step is, if you want to take action, is definitely please join our network. Watch our Twitter feed. There's a lot of exciting things going on, and we'll make sure there's a way that you can contact your lawmaker and ask them to co-sponsor this piece of legislation. So that would be our call to action for you. And with that, Paul, I will turn it over to you with anything else you'd like to chat about.
Well, first I'm going to actually ask Allison. Allison, you're the foremost expert on this legislation, and you've heard me talk about it for 25 minutes. So first, fact check anything I said. If there's anything that I said was indeed incorrect, please do let me know, let everybody know. But anything else you'd want to add from the topics that we already covered in the last little bit?
A+ student, as I would expect. I mean, this is Washington, D.C., right? Type A+. You totally passed with flying colors. So nailed it, totally accurate. I'll say you're correct. In the short time that we've been talking, we've hit 70. I feel like I'm a game show host or something, like we're at 70 co-sponsors. Our goal is to get to 100, like I mentioned, for tomorrow. So after this call, Paul, Mark, I've been in touch with you guys for many hours and days, but I will update you on the lists if you want to push those out to your networks, including the people who are here who are asking if their member is on. We are circulating that list. It's not proprietary in any way. We want to get as many people as we can before we drop tomorrow at noon. So we've reached out to every person, both Republican and Democrat, who was co-sponsoring last year. Sometimes it just takes time. It's not because they don't want to. It's not because they're insisting on missing this deadline. It's just these things tend to be fast-moving trains when you finally get to the final text, and we have deadlines for ALS Awareness Month and these other things. I think this deadline for tomorrow is an important first step, and we're going to send a very important signal. So we're going to push to try to get to the highest number we can. But that's not to say that if your member gets on late that they don't care about this bill, right? We still have a ways to go. And so there's other opportunities as we move down the line. So I want to kind of set the expectations around these multiple deadlines in which we can add people. We will continue to add people until the bill gets to the House floor and is passed. So tomorrow is important, but it's not the only day that will be important in this legislation's long journey to the White House and the president's desk. And I guess the only other thing I just wanted to add on, as you were listening to the questions, I think Mark fielded this. I don't want to take too much time from anyone, but I think the most important thing, Congressman Fortenberry touched on this, but knowing the bill intimately at this point and knowing where the potential philosophical hurdles may still exist around some of those power structures that Paul really did a good job of laying out, right? Is it just a lack of creativity? Is it a misunderstanding about what can actually be applied? Is it, government agencies have mandates. Those are not casual things. Those are binding legal mission statements that they are obligated to operate under. So that's part of the reason that this status quo shift for NIH is uncomfortable, because they are a research organization by their primary nature. And so my main message, especially to patients who are in the neurodegenerative community, who are actually accessing care, going to their doctors, trying to get into clinical trials, trying to reading every possible little study, right? Like when you're in a disease specific space and you've gotten into that headspace where your life has, fighting for your own health or your loved one's health in a disease specific space has become a vocation. You know more than me. You know more than researchers who are removed from it, despite however good our intentions are. You know more than members of Congress. So coming to us in a way that is not necessarily, like I like passion. I think that, we have to have fire behind this fight to move things forward. But simply explaining, actually, that's not how it works when you have a rare disease, and this is how it works. And not just telling us your story, but really driving into the fact that, no, if we had more access to treatment, this could happen for me. Or when I go and see my doctor and they don't have any clinical trials to show me, or they don't have anywhere to send me at a certain point, this could offer that new ramp. And we know that the research is so important because there's not enough. And that's not to take away, we really worked extremely hard on this version of the bill to deconflate the idea, which I believe is a false idea, that somehow expanded access or access to new treatment will take away from the very important work that research can and must do. We can do hard things and we can do both things at once, and we must. And so I think that the most important story that you can really tell is your very granular experience about how, when you are trying to access care, treatment, options, when you are actually in and out of your doctor's offices, et cetera, or with your loved ones, or whoever you're advocating for, right, from your life, whatever brought you to this fight, that level of granularity is important, because I think the biggest barrier that we face is a fundamental misunderstanding of how patients actually access this stuff. Because in a vacuum here, when you're sitting in a committee room on the House side, these are amazing healthcare policy experts, but many of them just do not have any kind of visibility into what the patient experience actually looks like. They see it in a policy vacuum. So we have to break down those walls to say, actually, no, it's really not like that at all. And if you gave me the chance to get some of this treatment, I potentially could not only save my life or my loved one's life, but we can advance this forward and potentially eliminate these diseases for future generations. So I just wanted to kind of expand on what really, in my opinion, is the barrier that we're facing on this bill, because I think that honesty and transparency is important. We've made immense progress and we're almost there, and we're almost getting everybody sign off, but we have a little bit more education to do, particularly, as Paul said, to those committees of jurisdiction who may be accustomed to doing things a certain way because those types of health policies have worked in certain situations and they don't work so well in this rare neurodegenerative space.
All right. Yeah. Thanks so much, Allison. Those were all fantastic additional points to mention. And, Allison, you probably get asked to support about 10 new bills every single day. You know what can be convincing to bring an office on board, and listen to the words she just said, because those are the magic words, the stories to be sharing to bring your representative, to bring your senator onto the legislation. Absolutely. We're already 10 minutes over. Unfortunately, would love to spend another 50 minutes with you, just to kind of go through very briefly some of the questions. We don't have a bill number yet. We will very shortly. The legislation is set to be introduced tomorrow. We'll have a bill number very shortly thereafter, so that we all know what bill number to cite when we're supporting the legislation. We are, again, working with other partners in the space, such as ALS and ALS Association, who are supportive of the legislation and are going to be rallying the troops just as we are. Let's see here. If your representative or your senator isn't on board as of yet, you will have that opportunity either in the very near term or later on. It's never too late, unless the bill has actually already passed, to ask your representative and senator to support the legislation. So don't worry about missing the boat. You will have that opportunity either to join us or join others in asking your senator and representative to support the legislation. So with that, I think that covers some of the questions that we saw in the Q&A box. I'm very sorry we can't get to all of them today. A lot of content to cover. Allison, any last words you'd like to offer? Okay, she's shaking her head. She's saying no. So again, everybody stay tuned. Tomorrow is going to be a big day. You're going to see the bill introduced. You're going to see press release from our leaders on Capitol Hill. You'll see more from MDA as well as our partners. You'll have that opportunity to contact your representative and senator asking for them to support the legislation as well. So with that, we're going to close today's MDA Advocacy Institute. Again, thank you everybody for joining us. We can't wait to partner with you on getting this bill passed into law as soon as we can. Thank you all.
Thank you.